Well, I'm very honored to be here, and I hope I can live up to the expectations of being found on an internet. I know there's so many people there, and I feel honored that I was found, so thank you so much for inviting me. I want to begin with this. I want you to create a scene in your mind. A man has opened his wardrobe, and he takes out what he's going to wear for work that day. What's on the hanger? Think about what that is. Do you have it? Okay. Most likely you thought about something that was more similar to this bottom image, a suit. Maybe this trope of the gray flannel suit. You didn't think about the top image. He didn't take out a white furry vest, a long poofy white skirt, a hat with a veil. You may have also thought about what body took out that garment. Now, most likely, though, he took out this suit because clothing has such an important role in our culture. Clothing transforms our flesh, our body, into something recognizable and meaningful in culture. And so by taking out that suit, the man has taken out something that represents power, authority, status. Now, that gray flannel suit that might represent status didn't always represent status. Before, we used to see that to represent status, men wore quite fitted clothing, clothing with embellishment that was flamboyant, that had loud, vibrant patterns. But somewhere around the end of the 18th century, although scholars debate exactly when, there was a shift in men's clothing. Men's clothing moved away from being flamboyant to being much darker in color, looser in fit, much less embellishment. Now, this was often called the Great Masculine Renunciation, where the most dominant form of masculinity was defined in opposition to flamboyance, to fashion, to femininity. And so this idea of the dark gray flannel suit came into being as the epitome of masculinity. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that men have not worn flamboyant clothing. They absolutely have. Lots of marginalized men have used clothing as a way to claim their own identities in a world that sought to oppress them. Certainly, many privileged men have also worn flamboyant clothing. Often the fashion industry has remarketed these clothing as a symbol of status, such as during the Peacock Revolution in the 70s. And right now on the runways, we're seeing many menswear designers market clothes that are conventionally worn by women or with patterns conventionally worn by women to men. Nevertheless, this gray flannel suit continues to have such power in culture and in the workplace. Now, 2 years ago, Erin Casanova wrote this fantastic book called Buttoned Up. She interviewed men in 3 American cities on their workplace dress practices. And what she found was that there were a ton of options available in the market, but men continued to gravitate towards a restrained style of dress, the suit. Now, Erin Casanova called this the strategic embrace of conformity. What she meant is that men with all these options chose something to fit in, not stand out, because that would allow them to access their gender privilege. Now, if we go around a bank, a law firm, most corporations, we see this gray flannel suit. These findings make sense. But what really intrigued me about this research was a comment that Erin Casanova made at the end of her book. She said, you know, all of these findings about conforming to white-collar masculinity, it made me curious about the outliners. Now, she says, these are men who throw caution into the paper shredder and do their own thing, experimenting with colors, patterns, accessories, and why not? Chainmail shirts to the office. These men aren't, right? Why not? And these men aren't embracing conformity. What they're doing is they're embracing what Madison Moore calls fabulousness. Now, fabulousness is when people, often queer people, black people, brown people, have turned their bodies into works of art, have used aesthetics and clothing as a way to subvert normative identity categories, as a way to claim space, and as a way to introduce new forms of identity into the world. But what happens when these fabulous men enter a Western culture and enter the workforce? They face a tension, right? If we think of masculinity as being in this conflicting and fluid hierarchy, right? So men can move between these different versions of masculinity, but it's controlled by hegemonic masculinity, the most dominant form of gender practice, the type of masculinity that normalizes and legitimizes patriarchy. This masculinity pushes down on all other expressions of masculinity. So when these fabulous men enter culture, enter the workforce, they face a masculinity dilemma, right? Their form of gender performance conflicts with expected norms. Now, it really conflicts with the expected norms because despite variation in social position and race and class and body type and age, the core of hegemonic masculinity is not being a woman. And so by wearing clothing that is conventionally associated with femininity and with women, by outwardly expressing their love of fashion, they are disrupting the very core of the most dominant form of gender practice. And so this is what I want to look at today. I want to look at how fabulous men negotiate the masculinity dilemma that arises from their styles at work. So as these men are fabulous in the workplace, they wear sparkles and sequins. How do they negotiate the masculinity dilemma that arises? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw from a 3-year study that I undertook. And I had the privilege to go into the wardrobes of 50 diverse men in Toronto, Canada. And these men ranged from 18 to 72, had a range of jobs, a range of races, backgrounds, body types. And these men opened their wardrobes, and we talked about all the clothes that hung in there. We talked about the meanings, the feelings, the experiences that they attached to them. And because I get to work in a fashion and art school, part of our dissemination isn't just writing these up, but also sharing them artistically. And so with a group of students, the participants took part in fashion photo shoots, and also we put on a fashion show where the participants wore their own clothing and performed their own expression of gender. And if you go to the website for the project, refashioningmasculinity.com, we have all the photos and a video of our fashion show. And so what I'm going to do is draw from some of these stories. Now, I certainly found men who embraced conformity at work. They wore the suit. But I'm going to focus on the men that didn't, the men that never fit in to the male ideal, never fit into the norm. And so they thought, well, because I don't fit in, the limitations are endless. So this is the first man I'm going to introduce you, and I'm going to introduce you to 4 men who have a range of fabulousness, and we'll talk about what that means. This is Chad. He's 47, he's straight, he's white, he's a medical researcher, and he loves wearing clothes that are much more fitted. But even though he loves fitted clothing, he's concerned about when he actually wears these clothes at work. So in his quote here, he's talking about giving a presentation to a group of nephrologists. And he says, these nephrologists are primarily older. Maybe I wouldn't wear something so fitted. I'd wear something more conventional. The idea behind this is that he was worried that what he is saying when he gives a talk might not really be heard, that these nephrologists might be so focused on his clothing and on the fit of his clothing that his credibility in the workplace is undermined. But even when he's not sort of giving a talk in certain rounds, when he's just in meetings and operating day to day, he loves vibrant colors, conflicting patterns. But he remembers one time when he wore an outfit with this conflicting patterns, a blazer, a shirt, a pair of pants, a tie, and he was at a meeting, and someone said to him, you know what I wish? I wish I could pull off wearing that kind of clothing. It was a compliment, but on the other hand, maybe it wasn't. That was a minor push on my expression. It was a pretty minor thing. I wasn't wearing stiletto heels, but a comment was made. So maybe these aren't outward comments about what someone's wearing. It's more of a microaggression. But this certainly made him conscious of what he wore as a medical researcher. The next person I want to introduce you to is Bob, who is a professor. He's queer, he's transgendered, he's 53 years old, and he's white. And he loves wearing clothes that deliberately challenge norms around gender and sexuality. So what he'll do is he'll go to a girl's clothing store, buy a graphic t-shirt, cut out that graphic, change it, and then sew it onto a black t-shirt. So one of his favorite t-shirts, he cut out a graphic that said, Daddy's Little Princess, and changed it to Daddy's Little Prince, and then put that on a black t-shirt. Now, he'll sometimes wear that to the university, to class, but often he'll wear more what he says are regular clothes. So maybe a slim-fit jean, a button-down shirt with polka dots. He loves his orange glasses. They're round and bright, bright orange. He loves to find ways to tweak his identity, to fit in, but still let someone know that he's trans. Nevertheless, he's cautious about when he tweaks his identity. He showed me one suit, and this was a suit he wore for an interview. He was going up for a leadership role in his department. And he decided to wear this suit because he wanted to offset any expectations or any stereotypes that people might have that he was an oddball colleague. He wanted to wear a suit because, as he says, he was going up against a traditional academic hierarchy. Notions of gender, who's a leader, what does that person look like, what does that person wear, all came into play. And so to perform in that academic hierarchy, to offset any notions or any discrimination that would exist because he was transgendered, he decided to wear a suit and not tweak his identity. Now, other men I spoke to followed this same strategy. One of the participants is an elected government official, and he's South Asian, he's Sikh, he wears a turban and has a long beard. He talks about when he's visiting constituents, when he's in parliament, he'll often wear a very slim fit but very tailored suit in order to offset, as he says, any discrimination that could occur, any misconceptions. It allows him to tip the balance of power. Bob, though, loves wearing slim-fit clothing, clothing that allows him to have a more playful expression of masculinity. But when he buys men's slim-fit jeans, they often are quite fitted, but he needs to pack when he wears them, which means he'll put in a fake penis. But when he does that, he's often worried that when he packs, it could shift, it could fall out. He's concerned. And this really makes us think about the body. Who are clothes designed for? What bodies are able to rein in fabulousness, play with fabulousness, and which bodies can't, based on the design of clothing? The next man I want to introduce you to is Andre. Andre is a grade 6 school teacher. He's black, he's queer, and he has an expression of style that he calls gender more. He loves taking hyper-masculine and hyper-feminine signifiers and mashing them up in a single outfit. But for Andre, this isn't just part of who he is. This is part of his job. As a teacher, he says, my job is to teach students about gender, to teach students about sexuality. A lot of his students in grade 6 are just learning about these concepts themselves. And so he sees that his playful clothing is part of his job. It gives him competence when he works. And he's not the only one who felt that way. Another participant who worked in the cultural department of a city government said that he loves to amp up his fabulousness. When he meets the mayor, when he meets the commissioner, they expect him to really play up his clothes. It shows he's creatively competent. But even in these professions, even in these organizations that are about education, that are about creativity, men still rein in their fabulousness. Andre talked about a time when he decided to wear these great pink neon tights, a sequin top. He looked in the mirror and thought, maybe that isn't so professional. But he decided to put on a blazer because a blazer makes everything professional. He went to school, and when he got to school, he got called in by the principal. This made him think, what is professional at work? Even in this space, this education space that he said was a safe space, he really had to reflect about what he wore. The last man I want to introduce you to is Madison. Madison is a performer, he's an actor, he's black, he's queer, he's in his 30s, and he loves wearing conventionally women's clothing. In fact, he often shops in women's departments. So his closet is filled with gold, with silver, with sparkles, with lame, with tights and skirts and dresses. But even though he loves to dress in this way, he's sometimes still mindful about how fabulous he's going to be, and particularly when he's going to get funding for his shows. So often he'll go on business meetings, he's looking for money to produce his shows, and he'll be sitting across the table from a group of men in suits. Now, as he says, he'll mute his fabulousness a little bit, but not completely. And by being fabulous, so wearing, say, his day sequins rather than a full gold lame jumpsuit, those day sequins will disrupt the people across from him and will force them, as he says, to take in everything that fabulousness implies. Even though he does this, he's cautious that it could have a negative effect. He wants to be like, anyone who's scared off by a few sequins, I don't want to work with. But he knows that these people are giving him money, they are going to fund his show. He does have to be mindful of that. And so he will restrain what he chooses to wear. Now, he's not going to wear a suit. This idea of a jacket, a shirt, pants is not who he is. In fact, other participants said they would never wear a suit. It's not who they are. One man talked about the emotional and physical feeling he had when he put on a suit. He likened it to an allergic reaction. So he's never going to wear a suit. But Madison will still restrain his aesthetic when he's meeting business people to get funding for his show. The other thing that Madison has to worry about is finding clothes that allow him to express who he is and still fit his body. As a fat man, clothes aren't designed for him that allow him to wear sparkles and lame and sometimes tone that down a bit, but for his size, for proportions that are for him. Again, whose bodies can be fabulous, whose bodies are allowed to sort of tone down the fabulousness, and who can't. So what these stories show is that the findings are not that different from this strategic embrace of conformity, from those men that wore the gray flannel suit to the office. Even these men who are mixing patterns, who are wearing women's clothes, still feel restrained by gender norms at work. And I kind of want to visualize their stories through this. We can think of fabulousness on maybe a spectrum, right? There's maybe more muted fabulousness. Maybe where men are wearing traditional masculine silhouettes, they're wearing a jacket, pants, a shirt, but they'll have a flamboyant color. They'll have a pattern and texture, right, that allows them to challenge notions of masculinity. Or they're on the other end of this spectrum, right? They're fully wearing women's clothing. They're disrupting all notions of gender. But even though these two extremes exist, this more muted fabulousness and this flamboyant fabulousness, both groups curb their fabulousness at work. And what are some of the factors that influence this? Well, as we can see the organizational culture, do these men work in a hierarchy, right? Or in a more conservative organization, a hospital, a university? Or do they work in a creative profession or like a high school? They're situated workplace activity. So the men tailor what they're going to wear based on what they're doing that day. Are they giving a speech? Are they asking for money? Or are they simply doing a routine day-to-day job that they would always do? By their social location, right? The role of race, of age, of the body play an essential role. And of course, by policing, right? Both external policing, what their boss might say, being concerned about microaggressions from colleagues, to their own internal policing. What is someone going to think about me based on what I'm wearing? Am I going to get funding for my show? Are they going to take what I'm saying seriously? And in many ways, this sort of expands how we can think around masculinity. Now, there's this concept called hybrid masculinity, and it's often when privileged men draw on and appropriate elements of marginalized masculinities into their gender performance. So when middle-class white men appropriate aesthetic elements associated with African Americans, right? This looks like there's more gender equality, but in fact, it just obscures gender equality. What we see is almost it operating in the other way around here, that often marginalized men will draw on dominant notions of masculinity in order to shore up hegemonic masculinity. And that shows the power of hegemonic masculinity in the workplace and across different types of organizations, and also its flexibility. This also creates new lines of gender inequality, right? There's new lines of gender inequality drawn around the type of organization and that organizational culture. Is it a hierarchy, or is it more of a community or clan? Around the situated workplace activity, are men doing something that's more public-facing, giving a speech, asking for money, versus a routine day-to-day activity? And of course, around the intersections of social location, of the body. And what does this mean? Well, these fabulous men are masking their fabulousness at work. They're masking their individuality. They're masking their diversity. And so are they going to be creative disruptors and have creative ideas at work? Are they going to bring divergent thinking and new ideas to the table? This is really what I want us to think about today. What would happen if organizations that claim to value diversity, innovation, and creativity also encourage diversity, innovation, and creativity in their employees' clothing? Would these organizations have a greater understanding and execution of policies around diversity? Would these organizations create more innovative services and products? I think they would, and I want to share one final story that emphasizes this. This is Peter. He's a Chinese-Canadian man. He used to work in corporate retail, and he had to wear a suit. And he said it was awful, it was depressing. He'd take a shirt, and this would be his Monday shirt, his Tuesday shirt, his Wednesday shirt, his Thursday shirt, his Friday shirt. He cycled through it. It was a uniform. He then left corporate retail and moved to lifestyle retail. Things immediately changed. He got to play with fashion. And what he says is like changing into clothes that expressed me. It was like changing into a Superman outfit. It gave him this boost of energy and confidence that he can do anything. Well, I think in organizations, we want our staff to feel like they can do anything. And I think by playing and experimenting with clothing, this is one way to do that. And what I hope is that we can move towards organizational cultures where a man will not open his closet and say, "How fabulous is too fabulous?" And instead, we will create organizational cultures where a man will pull something out, hold it up, and say, "This is fabulous." Thank you.